In Nehemiah chapter 4, as we dig a little deeper into the story here. The wall is built to half its height and the breaches are closed. We heard because the people had a mind to work. Their heart was in it. And now today we see work coupled with warfare. That's the Christian life. It's building and defending. That's church life, building and defending. I think of the words of the Apostle Paul. He even said in one place, the defense of the gospel. And we find ourselves all throughout history, as other generations before us, defending the truth. And even in our day and age now, we're defending our families, our children that are coming up and what they're being taught and indoctrinated with. Defense. In fact, it must be one of the characteristics of an elder, holding fast to the faithful word, which is in accordance with the teaching, so says Titus 1, so that he will be able both to exhort in sound doctrine and refute those who contradict. So you have both, building up and defending. Well, today's sermon will be spoken under these headings: extreme peril, extreme vulnerability, extreme vigilance, and an extreme defender. So let's look first at extreme peril. You know, in chapter 4 and verse 11, we read these words: our enemies said, they will not know or see when we come among them, kill them, and put a stop to the work. Extreme peril. Here's force combined with subtlety. And also in verse 12, they will come up against us from every place where you may turn. So extreme peril. Verse 14, when I saw their fear, I rose up and spoke to the nobles and the officials and the rest of the people and said, do not be afraid of them. So here is this emotion of fear. In a previous sermon, I spoke about the emotion of anger. Here's the emotion of fear. It's very human. In fact, in the Bible, 462 times, some form of the word fear or be afraid, is related to us. Fear is understandable. It's not always irrational in view of human vulnerabilities. And you know that to be true from your own experience. I do. What are you afraid of today? Maybe there's some of you that are afraid of things this very day. Well, here in Nehemiah's situation, on account of the number and the power and how subtle the enemies were, the people were afraid. Now, the solution to that is, remember the Lord who's great and awesome. Nehemiah also said that to them. And so you and I, we need to handle our fear in such a way that we're not shrinking at the first alarm and wanting to give up because of fear. You know, a deserter is more demoralizing than a dozen adversaries. Someone who goes back and gives it up. And a man astutely had this insight. He said, one taken from the helpers and added to the hinderers makes a difference of two. So here you have that effect. Fear. They're in an extremely perilous situation. Well, for you and I, is our peril any different? Jesus said, I send you out like sheep among wolves. Now you take a sheep and surround him with a pack of wolves, he's going to be afraid. Would we say that's irrational fear? No, we would not. We would say that it's rational fear, in the interest of self-preservation. So Jesus said, be wise as serpents. I think of those words in 2 Timothy chapter 3, at the very beginning of the chapter. The apostle warns Timothy in what was likely his last interaction with Timothy. And he says, but realize this, that in the last days, difficult times will come. Now, the NAS translates that difficult, and it's too mild of a word. The original is perilous, dangerous, furious, fierce times will come. That's far more radical than just difficult. Oftentimes we can face difficulty, and fear is not the responding emotion, but fierce and furious and dangerous, then fear is the emotion. And he goes on to describe why it would be like that. Men will be lovers of self and lovers of money and boastful and arrogant and revilers and all of those other things. But also included in there is unloving and irreconcilable, malicious gossips without self-control, brutal and haters of good. That's the end. That's the time that we live in. Treacherous and reckless, and yet at the same time holding oftentimes a form of godliness. So that's the perilous times that we live in. We're told that our enemy is like a lion prowling around looking for someone to devour. Now, if there's a lion outside, and you know that to be a fact, and you leave your house, is it irrational to be afraid? It's in the interest of self-preservation. None of us would go out and walk around in the pasture if we knew there was a lion out there. Our enemy is insidious. The Bible says he disguises himself as an angel of light. Evil is often marketed as good. They call it progressive. We're making progress. They label it as freedom. Be who you want to be, not necessarily what you were born as. It's freedom. We don't need to be married. We'll just live together. What's the Bible but some archaic old book written millenniums ago by a bunch of patriarchal old men? You see that all the time. Satan is an angel of light. Danger lurks wherever we least expect it. You get up and go to work in your necessary occupation, you don't know but what you might be thrust into a spiritual danger. In our allowable pleasures, I'm doing something that's just fine. As far as morality is concerned, it's amoral. Not bad or not good assigned to it, and you find yourself under attack. And in the company and the influence of our closest friends. Our enemy is called a murderer. Jesus said he was a murderer from the beginning. When he speaks a lie, he speaks from his own nature. He's the father of lies. Jesus said the thief comes to steal, kill, and destroy. Judas, once used by Satan, is left in despair to go out and hang himself. Someone said sin is a terrible guest. It always burns its lodging to the ground. So the enemy here is formidable. He's well numbered. He's well supplied, well armed. He's in alliance on all sides around, persistent and openly hostile. In Nehemiah's day, when they're trying to get the wall built, and in our day, the same. Paul said in regard to ministry, he said, a wide door for effective service was open to me, and there are many adversaries opposed at every turn. There's extreme vulnerability. Verse 19 tells us, I said to the nobles and the officials and the rest of the people, the work is great and extensive, and we are separated on the wall far from one another. They were very vulnerable with only half a wall built, but they were even more vulnerable when they were trying to finish it. The work is great and extensive, and we are separated. Well, what is that? Distracted and distanced. That's the ideal time for an attack. I was talking to, I believe it was Rodney the other night at prayer meeting, and told him the Lord has blessed me in a season in my life where I have minimal distraction, big distraction. Things are pretty settled, and the atmosphere is good for ministry when it's like that. But it might not be like that for you. You might have family problems, you might have health problems, you might have huge distractions. Those things are times when the enemy attacks, and we're vulnerable, extremely vulnerable. Let's read the text today from Nehemiah chapter 4, and verse 14. We'll start at verse 14. It'll overlap just a bit, but that'll be okay. When I saw their fear, I rose and spoke to the nobles, the officials, the rest of the people. Do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord who's great and awesome, and fight for your brothers, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your homes. And it happened when our enemies heard that it was known to us and that God had frustrated their plan, then all of us returned to the wall, each one to his own work. And it came about from that day on that half of my servants carried on the work, while half of them held the spears, the shields, the bows, and the breastplates, and the captains were behind the whole house of Judah. And those who were rebuilding the wall and those who carried burdens took their load with one hand doing the work and the other holding a weapon. As for the builders, each wore his sword girded at his side as he built, while the trumpeter stood near me. And I said to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people, the work is great and extensive, and we are separated on the wall, far from one another. At whatever place you hear the sound of the trumpet, rally to us there. Our God will fight for us. So we carried on the work, with half of them holding spears from dawn until the stars appeared. And at that time I also said to the people, let each man with his servant spend the night within Jerusalem, so that they may be a guard for us by night and a laborer by day. So neither I, my brothers, my servants, nor the men of the guard who followed me, none of us removed our clothes. Each took his weapon even to the water. Extreme vulnerability. Well, we have Nehemiah's strategy and his maneuvers here. He organized a defense. In verse 13, he put detachments, properly armed men at vulnerable locations along this half-built wall. He organized a defense. And he exhorted the people to fight for their families, their wives, their children, their brothers, and their homes. Now there's a principle right there in passing for national life, and that is wars of defense, when they're necessary, are right in the sight of God. They should be bravely waged for the sake of our families and our homes. The regard for the highest welfare of our families ought to inspire Christians to stand up and fight for religious freedoms in our country. And there's also another principle that's displayed here, and that is a national defense that's prepared for war is a security for peace. He prepared them, and as the story goes on, it prepared them for peace. It dissuaded the enemies. Well, here they are in extreme peril, and here they are extremely vulnerable. And here they are extremely vigilant. The threat is imminent, and Nehemiah organized a defense, but he organized a defense without sacrificing labor. That's kind of amazing to me how he could do that. The work continued on. And the principle here is, in every generation, the Christian is both a builder and a fighter, a soldier and a builder. Well, during the daylight hours, the workers, they worked overtime. We're told in verse 21, daylight to starlight. That's overtime in anybody's book. The builders worked overtime in the midst of all of this vulnerability and peril. Half of them worked construction, so they had their hard hats on. And half of them held defensive weapons, so they had their helmets on. You've got that in verse 16. Hard hat and helmet. Everyone was fully prepared to fight, as prepared they were to work, implying that all of us are as much a soldier as we are a builder. And then the supporting workers were armed and ready in verse 17. That is, the ones that carried burdens and those kinds of things. And the construction crew was armed, sword at the ready. I guess you've got to have both hands available if you're going to be building a wall. So you hang your sword on your side, but they're armed and ready. And Nehemiah, he utilizes what has been classified as the shift system. That is, he's got military officers in verse 16, captains they're called, stationed in key places to direct counter-offensives. And then they had their comms up and running in military terminology. A trumpeter stood by Nehemiah right there, ready to sound the alarm, and unmistakable communication. And the whole idea was the defense then would shift to wherever the alarm was sounded, the vulnerable spot, the shift system. So you see, Nehemiah, he's thought this out, and it's pretty well planned. Well, that was daylight. Well, from daylight to starlight. Well, what about the nighttime hours? Well, then those people that had come to help in Jerusalem with the construction from other towns were exhorted to spend the night in the city. Don't go back to your town. Spend the night in the city till we get this done, because we're really vulnerable here. And not only that, but Nehemiah, he set a worthy example. He and his officials in verse 23 remained clothed. They slept in their clothes and took their weapons even when they went to the water. So this is the picture we've got here. The wall's half built, and this is the situation. Working overtime and trying to defend it. So all this fear and this extreme vulnerability and extreme vigilance night and day, trying to sleep with your clothes on, distance and separation, that would tend to produce a paralyzing fear, were it not for one thing, and that is an extreme defender. In verse 20, Nehemiah concludes the whole thing, our God will fight for us. It reminds me of Psalm 127:1. Unless the Lord builds the house, they labor in vain that build it. And unless the Lord guards the city, it's useless. The watchman keeps awake in vain. We have the invincibility of God on display here. and the faith of Nehemiah to trust in it. In Deuteronomy chapter 1, the words of Moses to the people in regard to giants in the land were this: do not be shocked nor fear them. Now, if you saw a giant like Goliath, we heard about him a number of Sundays ago. If you saw that guy right there, it would be shocking, and I don't know about you, but it would fill me with fear. Do not be shocked nor fear them. The Lord your God who goes before you will himself fight on your behalf, just as he did for you in Egypt before your eyes. Moses is saying, based on the past experience, God fought for us in Egypt and delivered us. Don't be afraid of these giants in the land. Deuteronomy 3, I commanded Joshua at that time, saying, your eyes have seen all the Lord has done to these two kings, and so the Lord shall do to all the kingdoms which you are about to cross. Do not fear them, for the Lord your God is the one fighting for you. That's another time. Now, here we've got the Lord, our God, fighting for us. But what does that mean for you and I? For Nehemiah, it was very real. It was formidable enemies attacking. Can I say, God will fight for me? Can you say that? God will fight for me? Well, whenever I read portions of the Old Testament that really encourage me, I lay hold on them and claim them for myself. And the verse that I stand on is Romans 15 and verse 4. Whatever was written in earlier times was written for our instruction, so that through perseverance and the encouragement of the Scriptures, that is, Old Testament Scriptures, you and I might have hope. So when I read God will fight for us, Nehemiah he's filled with faith and he throws it all on God's shoulders. I say that's me too. He'll fight for me. And when I read Moses' words, the Lord goes before you, he'll fight on your behalf against giants in the land and all, just like he did in Egypt. I say, hey, just like he did in Egypt and just like he did for Joshua, he'll do for me. In some way, nowadays, for the believer, there's a fuller example of God fighting for us than even the Old Testament guys experienced against giants and conquering kingdoms and all of that. The king of Assyria in 2 Kings 19 came up against this very city, Jerusalem, when Hezekiah was king, long before Nehemiah ever came on the scene. And that king of Assyria was very threatening and blasphemous. And he had conquered everybody up to this point, and he was pretty proud of himself and pretty high-minded. And Hezekiah prayed to God, took it all before God, laid it out before him. And this is God's response. He will not come to this city or shoot an arrow here. For I will defend this city, and I will save it for my own sake and for my servant David's sake. That almost gives you goosebumps. I will defend this city. He's not even going to shoot an arrow here. So does God fight for you and I? Yes, I say he does. How does he fight for us? I mean, what does it look like? We're not facing giants. We're not dodging arrows. We're not conquering kingdoms that way. How does he fight for us? Well, I say this way. First, he frustrates the plan of the enemy. Verse 15. It says there, It happened when our enemies heard that it was known to us and that God had frustrated their plan. He fights for us that way. He frustrates the plan of the enemy. He exposes the schemes of the enemy. Paul said, so that no advantage would be taken us by Satan, for we are not ignorant of his schemes. He exposes the schemes. He's fighting for us. You remember Elisha in 2 Kings 6, you can read about it there sometime. He's given the secret war plans of the enemy by God. The king of Aram says he thought he had a mole. He thought there was a leak in his officials there. He said, tell me which one of us is for the king of Israel. And one of his servants said, no, my lord, O king, but Elisha the prophet who's in Israel, he tells the king of Israel the words that you speak in your bedroom. How can you fight against that? He exposes the schemes of the enemy. You remember that assault that ambush that was planned on Paul in Acts 23? John alluded to it on his sermon. The son of Paul's sister heard of their ambush, and he came and entered the barracks and told Paul. Exposed their scheme. He escaped. He turns our enemies against each other. In the unseen realm, that happens. You remember Gideon in Judges 7? Here's an army of Midianites that are more than the sand on the seashore, with camels that are without number. And Gideon is reduced to 300 guys. And then, okay, I've got 300 guys. What's our strategy? Well, we take a clay pot and we put a torch in it. We station ourselves around this massive camp in the middle of the night, and we break the pot and shine the light and say, a sword for Gideon. That's our strategy? Why does God arrange it like that? It's for His glory. So there's no question what happened there. God fought for them. We're told they blew 300 trumpets, and the Lord set the sword of one against another, even throughout the whole army. In 1 Samuel 14, Saul and all the people who were with him rallied and came to the battle, and behold, every man's sword was against his fellow, and there was very great confusion. You see, it's not the first time that God did that. It's not the last time. In Isaiah 19, the heart of the Egyptians will melt within them, says the Lord, so I will incite Egyptians against Egyptians. And they will fight each other against his brother, and each other against his neighbor, city against city, and kingdom against kingdom. And the spirit of the Egyptians will be demoralized, and I will confound their strategy. He did it again. So he defends us by turning our enemies against one another. You remember that one battle in which the singers were the ones that were supposed to go out first in the battle? What kind of strategy is that? Okay, men, get ready. We're going to advance on the enemy. You singers, you go first. Well, here's what they sang. Give thanks to the Lord, for His loving kindness is everlasting. That was their song they were singing. And when they began singing and praising, the Lord set ambushes against the sons of Ammon and Moab and Mount Seir, so 3 nations. The Lord sent ambushes against them who had come up against Judah, so that they were routed. And how did it happen? The sons of Ammon and Moab rose up against the inhabitants of Mount Seir, destroying them completely. And when they had finished with the inhabitants of Seir, they helped to destroy one another. 3 nations. So you see, the Lord fights for us. He frustrates their plan, He reveals their strategy, and He sets them against one another. Well, that's not all. He stacks the field of battle against the enemy in sovereign, circumstantial ways, using natural elements oftentimes as his weapon. Everything's a weapon in the hands of God. Think of the plagues, natural elements. In the conquest of the nations under Joshua, God at times sent hornets to destroy the enemy. And then on another occasion, hailstones out of the sky killed them. He struck the Sodomites with blindness so they couldn't find Lot and break into his house. The church prays and prison doors swing open and chains fall off and guards stand there like dead men while Peter's rescued from a high security inner prison cell. God does that. He stacks the field of battle. How can you fight that? Moses at the Red Sea said to the people, "Do not fear and stand by and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will accomplish for you today. The Egyptians whom you have seen today, you'll never see them again forever. The Lord will fight for you." Where have we heard that? "While you keep silent." So at the morning watch says that the Lord brought the army of the Egyptians into confusion, and he caused their chariot wheels to swerve. However that looks, I guess, guys going everywhere. And he made them drive with difficulty. Why did he do that? He stalled them out in the Red Sea so that he could collapse the whole thing on them. But he gave Israel enough time to get across. God was fighting for them. And it was in such a supernatural way the Egyptians recognized it. They said, "Let us flee from Israel, for the Lord is fighting for Israel against the Egyptians." And they tried to get out of there, but it was too late. He stacks the field against the enemy, and he uses natural means. That's another way that he fights for his people. Some of you are more familiar than others with the Scottish Covenanters. Maybe you've read some of the books about them, Fair Sunshine being one of them. There was a Scottish Covenanter named Alexander Peden, and he was known as Old Sandy, short for Alexander. And he and others were being hotly pursued by the dragoons. You know, they were viciously persecuted and tortured and executed. And they took to the hills, which often provided refuge for the Covenanters. And although they were weary and quite worn out, as the story goes, they managed to reach a reasonable height above their persecutors. And there Alexander Peden stood up and he said these words to his small band. He said, "Let us pray here, for if the Lord hear not and save us, we're all dead men." And then he prayed, and this is his prayer. "Lord, this is thy enemy's day and hour and power. They may not be idle, but hast thou no other work for them than to send them after us? Send them after those to whom you'll give strength to flee, for our strength is gone. Twist them about the hill, O Lord, and cast the lap of thy cloak over poor old Sandy and these poor things, and save us this one time, and we will keep it in remembrance, and tell to the commendation of thy goodness, thy pity and compassion, that thou didst it for us at such time." What a prayer. Well, that prayer was remarkably answered because a cloud of mist immediately settled on them and shrouded them so securely that they were completely hidden from their persecutors, who were confounded in the mossy bogs. And then orders were given to the soldiers to go instead and search for James Renwick, a great company with him. And so Peden and those with him were spared. He stacks the field against the enemy, settles a mist on the guys, and they're hidden from view and escape. Those who contend with the Lord will be shattered, it's said in 1 Samuel 2. Against them he will thunder in the heavens. If that weren't enough, he gives his angels charge over you. They'll bear you up, lest you dash your foot against a stone. In the unseen realm, Hezekiah said, "Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or dismayed before this king of Assyria and all the horde that's with him, for there are more with us than there are with him." In the unseen realm. With him is an arm of flesh, but with us is the Lord our God to help us and to fight our battles. And the people took confidence from the words of King Hezekiah. And you know what happened? An angel came in the middle of the night and destroyed the entire army. And their leader went back by himself in shame and was killed in the house of the temple of his God by his own family. He fills us, his people, with faith and courage so that we can believe that he fights for us. And then take the battle to the enemy. He stacks the field against the enemy. The jawbone of a donkey is all that's necessary to kill 1,000 Philistines. In the hands of God, the Spirit of God came on Samson. Chariots of iron are no match. Multitudes of warriors are no match. When you get some time, read 2 Chronicles 14. The Ethiopians mustered 1,000,000-man army and 300 chariots of iron. And Asa called to the Lord his God and said, "Lord, there's no one besides you to help in the battle between the powerful and those who have no strength, so help us. O Lord our God, for we trust in you, and in your name we've come against this multitude. Your God, let not man prevail against you." So it says the Lord routed the Ethiopians before Asa. Caleb, you remember that guy. He's quite an inspiration. 80 years old and just as strong as he was in the days of his youth. He said, in Numbers 14, Caleb said, "Do not fear the people in the land. They're bread for us. We'll eat them up. Their protection is removed from them, and the Lord is with us. Do not fear them." To Joshua, the walls of Jericho and a trumpet blast, and they fall down. The shout of the people. The Philistines capture the ark and bring it back to their cities. But after they brought it around, the hand of the Lord was against the city, causing very great panic, and he afflicted the men of the city, young and old, so that tumors broke out on them. And there was deadly confusion throughout the city. I don't know what that is, deadly confusion. And the hand of God was very heavy there. David came up against the giant Goliath. We heard about it a few Sundays ago. He took 5 stones. All it took was one, the first shot. 1 shot, 1 kill for David. Why did he take 5? In case the first one missed or something. But when God is involved, 1 stone is all it takes. David said, "The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of the Philistine." How can David fight a lion? He said he claimed to Saul that he took it by the beard and killed it. How can he do that? The Lord delivered him. How can one shepherd boy stand up against the paw of a bear? The Lord delivered him. The same way the Lord delivered him from the Philistine. So he stacks the field. He nullifies the counsel of the enemy. I hope I'm not wearing you out, because this is encouragement from the Old Testament for you. He nullifies the counsel of the enemy. Job says he frustrates the plotting of the shrewd so that their hands cannot attain success. Proverbs tells us there's no wisdom and no understanding and no counsel against the Lord. David, the psalm writer, in Psalm 33, the Lord nullifies the counsel of the nations and he frustrates the plans of the peoples. All of this is under the heading of God fighting for them. You remember when David was fleeing from Absalom in Samuel 15, you can read about it there. He had a very trusted, good counselor named Ahithophel. And someone told David, saying, Ahithophel is among the conspirators with Absalom. Now, that was something to lose right there. Your number one counselor, and he's now over with the conspirators. David's response? David said, O Lord, I pray, make the counsel of Ahithophel foolishness. That was his prayer. We read 2 chapters later how the counsel of Hushai the Archite was chosen over the counsel, the good counsel of Ahithophel. I mean, if Absalom would have followed the counsel he got from Ahithophel, David would have been history. They would have come on David when they were completely worn out. They would have struck hard and struck early and struck fast. Instead, they go with the advice of Hushai, who says, no, wait, we'll gather all our army, we'll gather cities around us, we'll go take them by force later. The counsel of Hushai the Archite is better than the counsel of Ahithophel. That's what they said. For the Lord had ordained to thwart the good counsel of Ahithophel, so that the Lord might bring calamity on Absalom. You can't fight against that. Devise a plan, but it will be thwarted. State a proposal, but it will not stand, for God is with us. Isaiah 8:10. He's the one who catches the wise in their craftiness. He says, I am the Lord who frustrates the signs of liars and makes fools out of diviners, and who turns wise men back and makes their knowledge foolish, who confirms the word of his servant and fulfills the counsel of his messengers. Elisha's servant, do you remember? What are we to do, Master? Elisha prayed, he prayed that God would open his eyes, and when he did, he saw chariots all around them of fire. And the conclusion was, greater is he that is with us than he that is with them. Well, it was said to Jeremiah when he was commissioned to be a prophet, behold, I make you this day a fortified city, an iron pillar, and bronze walls against the whole land, against the kings of Judah, its officials, its priests, and the people of the land. That's a lot of people. They will fight against you, but they will not prevail against you, for I am with you, declares the Lord, to deliver you. Talk about armor. The Lord said to Paul in a vision, do not be afraid, go on speaking, do not be silent. Why? For I am with you, and no one will attack you to harm you. I have many people in this city. One of your men puts to flight 1,000. For the Lord your God is he who fights for you, just as he promised. How else could one do that? Put to flight 1,000. Okay, so I've worn you out with all these Old Testament examples, and they're more than that. Plenty more than that. And I say whatever was written in earlier times is written for your instruction. Don't let anybody tell you different, whatever their philosophy of Bible understanding might be. The Old Testament was not just for Israel. It was written for our instruction so that through perseverance and the encouragement of the Scriptures we might have hope. Now, based on that and all of those Old Testament examples and the understanding that God is for us, He fights on our behalf against our enemies by frustrating their plans, exposing their schemes, stacking the field against them in battle, confounding their counsel, all of those things. Based on all of that, you and I ought to be able to adopt those things as prayers and say, Father, would you frustrate their plans? Here they are blaspheming and assaulting you and your word and all that's good and right and holy in your sight. Would you frustrate their plans? Would you expose their schemes? Please turn them one sword against the other, like you did in all of these Old Testament accounts. Cause them to destroy themselves and be at such a battle among themselves that they can't get anything accomplished. Nullify their counsel, turn it to foolishness. We ought to be able to pray like this. Stack the field of battle against them. Cause confusion to arise within their ranks and their chariot wheels to swerve and drive with difficulty so that they cannot achieve success in their wicked ways. You see, we can pray that way. We can lay hold of those things in the Old Testament that happened for us. So when we read this account of Nehemiah and how they were so fearful and under such a threat and a peril, and they were so vigilant night and day, but the final word was, God will fight for us. Come wherever the trumpet is blown. Then we can lay hold on that and be encouraged. Our enemies may be great and terrible, just like I spoke of earlier, the lion that's prowling and all of those things, the murderer and the liar and the angel appears as an angel of light. That's our enemy, for sure. Great and terrible. But what are they against God? They're not anything against God. Well, lay hold on that. Our God will fight for us. As it turned out, their plans were frustrated, and there never was a battle. Although they still worked overtime with their swords strapped on their side, sleeping in their clothes. Well, amen. The Lord give us help that way, that we might lean on Him, have the faith to believe Him. Our God will fight for us.